Hello everyone and welcome back to the Maggie Walker Project. I'm excited to introduce to you another video today, but first I want to make a quick disclaimer about the length of these videos. I want to keep them around 15 to 20 minutes long so that they're completely digestible. So for my longer videos, I will be splitting them up into parts. I also want to introduce the new Instagram and Spotify pages. On Instagram, I'll be releasing the most valuable snippets of each interview, and I'll also be posting some insight into each interviewee. Whereas on Spotify, I'm going to be releasing the full-length audios for each interview so that you can listen to them in more of a podcast form. Links will be in the description for both. Now, today's interview is with Stephen Jones. He's experienced a diverse array of fields and career paths, whether it ranges from 20 plus years in the Navy to returning back to education at the renowned Harvard University, or even advocating for veterans with his nonprofit. He's chosen to intertwine his passions with his career, and I'm super excited to show you the interview that I had with him. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this project. I think it's a fantastic initiative that you're doing. But I was born in Lake Jackson, Texas, which is just south of Houston, and just a little bit north of Galveston. Both my parents worked at Dow Chemical. They were chemists, and in 1978, they were transferred to Midland, Michigan, where I was raised primarily in Midland, Michigan, which is about 3 hours north of Detroit, near Saginaw. And so it's like, small town, about 30,000 people. It's a great place to, grow up, had good friends. Interesting fact about Midland, I think when we moved there, there was only like 10 Black families in the entire town. And so as a result of being Dow Chemical's headquarters, it was one of, I think, 30 communities in the United States where the average Black income was higher than white income because of the recruitment of African American professionals. And there's really no reason for them to move there unless it was for Dow Chemical. So that's where I grew up.
Hmm. And that's a very interesting statistic. Did you feel that that contributed anyway to, your upbringing and just your sense of self as a Black person?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, I mean, we were kind of spread out throughout the grade. So even though they were 10, like my older sister, you know, my peer group had older siblings, and so my sister knew them. And so even though that there was a small group and there are only two high schools in that town, I was the only Black kid in my school from K through 12 in my grade. Let me say this, in my grade from K to 12. And I only had one Black teacher in the seventh grade. She was my English teacher, Mrs. Carruthers. But with that said, living in that community, it wasn't like, you necessarily had to search for examples of what you could be because there were lawyers, there were doctors, there were chemists, there were engineers, all manufactured in this town, you know, by chance. And so not thinking, I mean, but that's not how you think, when you're that, at that time. It's just that, hey, I'm going to go over to so and so's house and hang out, and their father's a president of Dow, the Dow Corning. You know what I mean? And that's just kind of how it was. But having a child myself and trying to expose my child to different professionals in different cities, we didn't have to join a club in order to do that.
Mm. Yeah, I guess it's really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
So for you, I guess it was kind of like subconscious representation that you always kind of had access to. It wasn't, some sort of distant, um,
Correct. Yeah, correct. Yeah. Yeah. So, fortunate enough that both my parents, they're still married, so they're both professionals. So there was an example. My mother comes from a family of engineers and farmers. And so even when I was to travel back to Texas, I had more examples to be able to draw from. Again, that's not what you're not steering towards there. You just like, that's just how it is. And so, I played sports, did academics, acted in plays with all these kids. But like I said, it was one or two, maybe three at a time. You know what I mean? And so it wasn't like, hundreds. I mean, it wasn't until college where I was actually exposed to hundreds of Black people in an academic setting. And
Mm.
that's at Purdue, which is a predominantly white institution, as you know.
Hmm. And when did you have an idea of what you wanted to do as a career?
Man, so yeah, so for me, I knew I wanted to be a pilot probably fairly early, maybe 11 or 12. My father was in the Marine Corps, was in Vietnam, and he was a mechanic for airplanes. And so he had lots of pictures. They call it like a Kodak reel to reel, where he took pictures and put them in the slides. Well, he would watch that. And so, as a, that's what I wanted to do. And so I went to Davis Monthan Air Force Base down in Tucson, Arizona, the airplane boneyard, got to climb on planes. When my mother was on a business trip in Washington, D.C., I got to go with her, took me to the Air and Space Museum. And, I built models probably up until, my early teens. And that's kind of like what I did for a hobby. When I was 15, I started getting my private pilot's license. And so I delivered newspapers in order to help pay for that. My father would pay for 50 hours. I think that's how much it costs to rent a plane. And it was 50 hours for the instructor. And that's what I did. Because I always wanted, it seemed like I always kind of wanted to be a pilot, but it didn't happen as automatically as I wanted to. And that being said, I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy at the time, but I did not get accepted. And so I had to figure out a different path in order to get it done. That
Mhm.
makes sense. Mhm.
Yeah, so you said you're getting your license for flying at 15, is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I see. I actually still have a picture after my first solo. But yeah, so I mean I mean, there was a little tiny airport in Midland called Midland Barstow, and the school is called Stevens Aviation. And I cannot remember the name of my instructor. I think it was his first name was Phil. But yeah, so I just kind of went for it. For any young person that's going to fly at that age, you're going to want to have your resources in place, but more importantly, you're going to want to have time, because consistency is your best way to succeed in flying. The more repetitions, the more often you do it, the better you'll be, because you only have an hour. And if you have not flown in a month, you'll spend half that time relearning what you learned the last time you did. So
Mm.
it's about the consistency.
Wow, I just think it's really fascinating that you were flying at 15. That's just crazy to me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was cool. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
And what was your first, job related to, and how did you attain it?
So, so my first like professional job, I did 21 years in the Navy. So, I spent a lot of time, especially when I was in college, doing internships. So I worked a lot of internships at General Electric. I worked in manufacturing, I worked in capital services, and I worked in financial services. It was during that time, my last job at GE Investments in Stamford, Connecticut, where the CEO of that business happened to be a retired Marine Corps aviator. And I had met somebody like over the weekend. I think I was at the park playing basketball, a recruiter. And he said, "Hey, you can join the Navy. The Navy needs pilots, come straight off the streets and go to officer candidate school to be able to do so." The CEO of that business, happened to be my mentor, because I was a FMP intern, financial management program intern. He had a little bit of special access as a new hire or whatever. And so, his advice to me was, "Hey, son, there's only certain things you can do when you're young, and GE will always be here." And so, after thinking about it after a week, I decided to pursue it. Went down there, signed up, took the aviation, I think it's called like the aviation battery test. And then from there, you get an interview and you know if you get selected or not. So I graduated in May 1998 from undergraduate, and showed up in Pensacola, Florida for officer candidate school in June of 1998. And that's what started my Navy career. And so for me, the way I guess I kind of got into it was there wasn't like a whole lot of examples that I could draw on folks that were ex-Navy naval aviators. I didn't know any, to be honest with you, other than the fact that, my favorite movie was Top Gun, right? In my town, I think there were like one kid that would get an appointment to the Air Force Academy every year out of high school, but the Navy wasn't necessarily something that was really recruited in mid-Michigan. So, having talked with the recruiter, my boss at General Electric, a whole, just get as much information as I could. And then just a lot of, I knew a lot about it. I just didn't know anybody, you know what I mean? And just kind of took the leap of faith that this is the right thing for me to do. Even the way that I got to GE, somebody would come back from a summer and they would talk about their summer on the East Coast. For some reason, growing up in the Midwest, I wanted to be on the East Coast and I wanted to be somewhere in New York or something, you know what I mean? And Chandrika, she came back from an internship and she said, they gave me a car, they gave me an apartment, and I got paid a salary. And I was like, that sounds like a lot of fun. And then I would just figure out how to do it. So I kind of let that kind of guide me, where if I didn't know how to do it, I would see somebody in the position or within the position, ask questions and then see if there's availability. If there's availability, I started to stick my foot in the door. And that was the same way for aviation for me. It was something that I wanted to do as a kid. Didn't think that I was going to be able to do it because I did not go to the Air Force Academy. I was majoring in accounting and finance at Purdue, but it came back around again, and I wasn't going to let it pass me by. And so, moved down to Pensacola, and so that adventure began.
Mm-hmm. And when you were getting your flight license at 15, and you didn't necessarily see yourself in the Air Force, I guess what was your motivation to kind of get your flight license and just be in that kind of
probably very much like yourself. It's a very competitive landscape, to get into the Air Force Academy. And so, your varsity athletics, your academic performance, your test scores, and your extracurriculars. Well, I was learning how to fly at a very young age as that kind of extracurricular wow factor for me to, help my package to get into the Air Force Academy. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Plus, I wanted to do it anyways. But, I was a student body president. I was, doing all of the things. So I looked very good on paper, except for my standardized test scores. And so that's where I struggled. And so because of that, I did not get accepted. And so Purdue was my second choice, but I'm so happy that it was that was the choice I ended up doing, because ultimately it was a very good fit for me. And so, a lot of things happened while I was at Purdue University, but I think ultimately I would have been happier where I ended up, not where I necessarily wanted to go, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting to have how things kind of like lined up for you.
Yeah.
So just in terms of, your extensive career, you have a career in, global development, aviation, organizational development. What originally drew you to like these diverse fields? And how do you feel that some of these advantages were?
Yeah, so it's a good question. For me, so when you're in the Navy, they have like this path, right? And and that path, what I mean by path, that is your way to success. That is your way to promote, to be able to get rank, and you want to have ever increasing responsibilities with sustained performance. Some type of way. That's how they do it. And so when I was first flying in the Navy, I flew helicopters, and it was a great opportunity to be able to do so, and I like doing it. My first time overseas, other than Mexico and Canada, was in the Navy. It was right after 9/11, and our squadron split between the Middle East and Italy, Bahrain and Italy, I should say. And so I was in Italy for the first half of when the war started. I was in Italy for the first half of that tour while I was flying helicopters. You don't really get to see a lot. I mean, you're on a ship, you're on a shore, you kind of do everything. But I also had an opportunity to switch communities while I was in the Navy. Fast forward maybe 6 or 8 years, I got a little bit, I have more rank at this particular time. So I am, when you think of like how things are organized, strategic, operational, and tactical. As a young junior officer, your primary responsibility is to be the most tactically proficient at your warfighting specialty as you possibly can. I mean, you are, you know, just to break it down, if your job is to like put square pegs into square holes, that's your tactical proficiency. Not knowing what that task is doing to the greater operation and what the strategic consequences are to those tactical instances that you are participating in. And as you grow up in rank, your vision or your tactical proficiency, you start to widen up, just as you would in any job on what the operations to take into, and then what the strategic implications. And when I got to see that, it was first when I was started switching communities, flying C-130s, big transport aircraft. And I got to travel all over the world. I think I visited 62 countries at that particular time, and spent the night. And so I think what was critically important for me was the flying part became less of the thing that made me get up every day, but it was like where I was going. And then it became like understanding is like, well, why does this place exist? Why does this war, why are these borders written, drawn that way? And so, so you started reading when I was at the war college. You start reading about World War II and about the Pacific Theater of Operation, the campaign to defeat Japan during World War II. Well, I got to go and fly to all of those little islands, those atolls where the Marines and the Navy battled their way across the Pacific all the way to Japan. I would land on this little piece of land, and so you just create this insatiable appetite for reading and understanding why the world behaves the way it does. And then I was lucky enough to go to the Naval Postgraduate School, where I wrote a thesis about how to train helicopter pilots in special operation tactics, international pilots. And I was even more blessed on having an opportunity to try to make that paper into a reality at United States Special Operations Command down in Tampa. Doing that, you learn that if there's 22 programs that the United States uses to as a foreign policy instrument, that can be governance, that could be economics, that could be educational. But of those 22 programs, I believe at the time, 11 of them were run by the Department of Defense. And so that means there's a lot of men and women that are going out on behalf of the United States saying, this is the path, this is what you want to do, this is the aid, this is how you govern, this is how you build a road, this is how you dig a well. And so it just becomes like this huge, and you're talking billions of dollars of aid gets spent every year on trying to help developing countries get better. And then you start realizing how important trade is in the world. So you start studying economics, because when I'm training pilots or developing schools, those things come with high ticket items like airplanes and education and visas to transfer folks and education. And you can see how it's all tied together, and where the military actually is a foreign policy instrument. It is one that you use at the very end, right? But it's also one that you can use in the beginning as an introduction um, 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 to a new capability, a new technology, a new way of manufacturing, where that technology transfer happens in that country is forever changed. And you can see that in examples like Japan, where after World War II, that's where huge technology transfer happened. And then you have the manufacturing industrial base of Japan that was built. So when you look at, for me, when I was studying it, I started looking at uh, national strategies, that are written by your secretaries of defense and your generals, like your national security strategy. And if you do that and you look at where trade is happening, you can see that there's a very close parallel to what's important to national security to what's important to economic growth for the United States. And so that just fascinated me. So I was able to mix business with economics, and then I just happened to be in the military. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Wow, that's really interesting. So I guess aviation for you is kind of like it was a ticket to seeing all these places in the world and seeing how everything kind of interconnected.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly right. It was, aviation, very young. That was a passion. And I read this book. I cannot remember when it was. I think it was called Crush It. It has nothing to do with aviation, but it has everything to do about finding your passion, defining what it is.